Welcome to episode 6 of the Zero Pressure podcast series, a relaxed conversation with those on the cutting edge of science and technology, hosted by me, Helen Sharman, and presented by Imperial College London and Saab. The Zero Pressure podcast series is looking at how science and technology can contribute to solving complex, interrelated global challenges today and tomorrow. Throughout this series, we've been investigating pioneering technologies and speaking to thinkers and doers at the leading edge.
The next generation of technologies is going to be much more advanced because now we're looking at satellite communications integrating with the terrestrial communications. And you have that connectivity all the time at a very, very reasonable cost. That means everybody on Earth can afford it.
As that sort of very basic infrastructure and discoveries, get laid out, then, it becomes usable to say, more research and academic institutions. And then, when further of that infra is there, and then the investments have been made to lay the foundation, so to speak, then the time for the commercial industry, in a way, comes to play.
Here's something I think is rather interesting. The heaviest satellite ever launched was an American communications satellite, and it weighed 6,900 kilograms. And that's nearly 7 tons. But the lightest satellite, as far as I can tell, was designed by an 18-year-old to demonstrate the performance in space of 3D printed carbon fibre. And it weighed just 64 grams. In this episode, we're talking about the new space economy, which seems to be the latest buzz phrase in the space world, propelled into common parlance partly by headlines about celebrities going into space on missions made possible by billionaires-owned space companies. But what exactly is new space? Traditionally, activity in space has been driven and financed by nation states. There have been subcontracts always, to commercial companies for decades, some public-private partnerships, even space spin-offs that have expanded and endured. Arguably, countries have been pushing for more commercialisation of the space industry for a long time, with varying levels of success. But what's transforming the space industry to such an extent that we have a phrase for it? New space. And certainly there's been financing, research and development of new innovative technologies, but it's the entrepreneurship and broader commercialisation of the space economy and its associated supply chains that's moving us further away from bureaucratic state-controlled space activity to an accessible, affordable, globally linked space industry, with investors seeing clearer pathways to profitability. More profits usually mean increased investment and new innovation, reduced timelines, lower cost to customers, and so it goes on. This is what we mean by new space, though I might change my mind about that after talking with our guests today. What are the real benefits of the private sector being more actively involved in space exploration? What are the risks? Join us as we discuss these issues and more with people who are already making a mark in the new space economy. Our first guest is Professor Andy Koronios, the CEO and Managing Director of the Australian SmartSat Co-operative Research Centre. It's a consortium of universities and other research groups partnered with industry, set up to catapult Australia into the global space industry through collaborative research and development. Andy is Emeritus Professor of Information Systems at the University of South Australia. With qualifications in electrical engineering, computing and education, he's over 25 years' experience in the academic environment, including as Dean of Industry and Enterprise at the University of South Australia. Andy's career includes working as a consultant and as a professional speaker on IT issues in Australia and Southeast Asia as well. He's a founding fellow of the International Institute of Engineering Asset Management, and he's editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Information Quality. Andy, welcome to Zero Pressure.
Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you.
Now, what does new space mean to you as a concept?
Space has always inspired me. I remember I watched the moon landing, huddled around a black and white television, which was the only television in my village in Greece. It always engendered boldness, curiosity, and the epitome really of human engineering, but it always seemed to be unattainable for me personally, and certainly for my country and my adopted country here in Australia. Only the big, the strong, and the wealthy countries could actually launch spacecraft and satellites. New space, on the other hand, makes it possible for everyone to participate. It kind of democratizes space, if you like. And that, of course, in turn, has really spun out an unbridled innovation in using space and space information products for the benefit of humankind. At the moment, the global space industry is around 400 billion US dollars. That is soon to be, in the next 10, 15, 20 years, 1.2 trillion, it's estimated. So for me, all space meant large, complex, expensive spacecraft and satellite. But new space is small, smart, and cheap. And in fact, in some cases, disposable, because satellites now can be the size of a very small cereal box or even smaller.
It's funny you mentioned those moon landings. I was 6 years old when Neil Armstrong took those first steps. And I don't think I really understood the significance. My dad dragged me down the garden and pointed at the moon and saying, don't you understand there are people walking on the moon? And of course, it's only as we get a bit older and we understand, my goodness, the significance of that. You mentioned $1.2 trillion forecast. That's a huge number. Almost my brain can't really quite get around trillions of dollars, I don't think. But you mentioned serial box size satellites. Is it the miniaturization, do you think? I mean, is it a kind of a technology that's changed? Or is there also somehow a different commercial appetite now?
I think it's a combination of factors, in my view, Helen. The miniaturization of electronics and the simultaneous increasing computational and storage power of computers. When those things were very big, there was no way that you could lift such a mass into space and do anything useful. But as you know now, your mobile phone is orders of magnitude more powerful than the electronics and the computational power of the computers that took the Apollo 11 to the moon. And that, of course, has meant that everything can be packed in smaller mass, smaller volume, and consumes a lot less power. And that is the golden triangle as far as launch is concerned, because launch has been always very expensive. The prices are coming down now because there are more people launching things. It is also standardization. Those cereal boxes, they don't come in any shapes or sizes. They come in different sizes, but they're usually multiples of 10 by 10 by 10 centimeter cubes. And that standardizes the payload, which means you can put them in canisters that can be self-contained. Nothing can go wrong during launch to cause problems for the bigger load. And therefore, these small little packages can be very securely and with low risk, piggybacking, if you like, ride sharing on the bigger satellites.
We can also send, can't we, many of these satellites in one launch. So I guess even if one isn't piggybacking on a bigger load, we can send over 100, I think, have already been on one launch a number of times. So if we can get many into space in one go, then the launch cost of each one diminishes.
Exactly, absolutely. Many people forecast that actually the price of launch is going to come down to as low as $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000 per kilogram. That is amazing. That would be orders of magnitude to what it was in the past.
Well, what is it at the moment, the cost of getting a kilo into space?
It does vary, and I'm not an expert in these commercial kind of prices and so on, but from what I read, anywhere between $50,000 to $80,000 a kilogram is what the current rate may be.
So we're going to reduce that yeah, by 10 or more in the next few years. That's quite a big ask in some respects, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot of expectations that appear to be created by this idea of new space. Are there technology opportunities you think that we might expect to come from it?
Certainly, technology development is in fact one of the biggest benefits, if you like, of space and a new generation of satellite technologies. Areas such as satellite communications, for instance. At the moment, we all enjoy satellite communications. We all enjoy navigation. In fact, most of us would struggle to find our way in cities and country towns and so on without some kind of Google Maps or equivalent. All of that is given to us through technologies that are basically space technologies. And that's just only a very small sample. Obviously, everybody checks the weather. Well, the weather is actually becoming a fine science because of the weather satellites. Financial transactions would not happen the way we transfer electronic funds. In fact, cash, particularly now with COVID, has just about disappeared. So there are a lot of technological benefits of satellite technologies and indeed space technologies. You know, your cell phone, your mobile phone has a little tiny camera. That's a direct result of space cameras. The memory foam, even enriched baby formula and dry vacuum dried food. All of that was initially made for astronauts, as you well know. So therefore, now we are using a lot of these for our daily lives. So I think there are many, many benefits. And of course, the next generation of technologies is going to be much more advanced, because now we're looking at satellite communications integrating with the terrestrial communications, with your mobile towers, if you like, so that you don't need to have a separate satellite phone if you're out in the remote, isolated areas. You have that connectivity all the time at a very, very reasonable cost. That means everybody on Earth can afford it.
I love all of these sort of spin-offs, of course, which is life's serendipity in many respects. But one of the things that I find quite lovely is this circuitous nature of, let's say, the miniaturization. So you talked about sort of miniaturizing things in order to use them in space, but then we started to use them on Earth in our computers and our phones. And then that commercialism on Earth has taken off, hasn't it? And now that's translating back into space.
Absolutely, it goes both ways. You're absolutely right, Helen.
What's Australia looking to accomplish in this new space arena, as opposed to perhaps any other part of the world?
Australia has had quite a lot of good heritage in space. We've had a legacy, let's say, of contribution to space. We're not really a spacefaring nation, and I wouldn't even say that we have been a space-capable nation. We do, however, we were in fact the third country in the world to launch a satellite from its own soil. But at that time, it was actually a very small satellite, like all of them were, including the first one, Sputnik. Since then, we have played a supporting but significant role in helping the American effort. As you know, the Apollo moon landing actually passed through the ground stations that are here in Australia. And we do have facilities now that we operate for NASA, the Deep Space Network, and other facilities, that we still make a contribution there. But we haven't really been at the global table for space. And since 2018, when our space agency was formed, established, and began operating, there's been a tremendous enthusiasm in Australia for us to really grasp this opportunity. That is why our federal government, but indeed many of the state governments and other agencies are really supporting the effort of the space agency, our universities, our government labs, and SmartSat plays one of the key roles when it comes to space research innovation, the space innovation enterprise.
So what I'm hearing is that we're still needing the nation states to invest, and possibly people like you to look into your crystal ball and be able to say, oh yeah, that bit of technology is going to, or is likely to develop into something really good commercially in the future. So we're going to invest in that rather than something else. We can't completely send the space industry away from the nation states just yet. Can we ever, do you think? Should we ever?
I think you're right about your point that we do need to invest. Research, by definition, leads you down to a lot of cul-de-sacs. So we have to say, well, okay, some of our investments will not pay off. We need to be able to actually wear that as a nation. But I also think that we need to look in the tapestry of activity and see where the opportunities might be. But government cannot just simply be the only investor. The commercial enterprise needs to invest in Australia and elsewhere, needs to invest much more. And as you know, of course, in the US, the Bezos and Elon Musks and others are already doing that. In fact, they very soon will be investing much more on space than the governments do. But in our small country, we don't have that luxury. So our government does need to be investing big to help the industry. But not only the government as an investor, but as Mariana Mazzucato says, you want the government to also be a customer. So that when the government of Australia and other countries, when they need space-based information services, data, and so on, they do put some confidence, or they even kind of underwrite, even if there is a risk, to local companies, Australian companies, or whatever the country may be, to help them find their first customer. And yes, the government could be the first customer. And that then provides that company the ability to stand on its feet, to grow and scale, and then become a global player and sell to the world.
Just tell me who Mariana Mazzucato is.
She's a professor of economics, a dynamo in the area of innovation, and particularly mission-based innovation, based in London at UCL. She has her own center. If you Google her, you will find her, as most people do, extremely enjoyable to listen to and very insightful.
So you mentioned all this about Australia. Is there a sort of a single global idea of what we need to do in terms of the new space economy, or is it really quite disparate?
Well, from my perspective, first of all, I strongly believe that space is indeed a global enterprise. Space, like most endeavor in our world at the moment, does require collaboration. We cannot just simply be an island, whether it's Australia or some other country of equal status, Canada and so on. I think that we can compete, but at the same time, we can collaborate. And that happens quite a lot in the space ecosystem. Up to now, though, space has been very much an international and a cooperative and a friendly enterprise. You only have to look up in space 500 kilometers to see that, because that's where the International Space Station is.
Is there another vulnerability? I don't mean perhaps technically, but is there a way that we could become, do you think, over-dependent on space? I worry about solar flares, something like that could kick out a whole load of satellites in one go.
I actually think that we now have become over-dependent on technology. And space is one of those technologies. The meteorology departments are talking about space weather, for instance, and they're taking that seriously with a lot of research and so on. So that already can be a problem. Losing the infrastructure that really drives terrestrial activity from space would be very transformational in a negative sense for us. There is no doubt about it. I believe that as technology moves in an exponential way, when we rely more and more on computers to make more and more of our decisions in real time without human intervention, then we are setting ourselves up for significant problems. I would say that technology is taking over, and we are so interdependent and interconnected that it would be very difficult to just pull the plug off the wall, so to speak.
It is a big thing, isn't it? This the whole idea that we become reliant on something that perhaps we're not in control of. What about the economy? I mean, we're not really in control of this. We call this new space economy. Is there a risk to the economy at all?
A risk from the space technology, or?
Well, I'm just thinking, is that what are the downsides possibly of this new space economy, that it's becoming not completely but less reliant on the traditional big countries putting in driving it really and making all the decisions? Is there a downside to this, or is it only good?
The commercialization, I use the word, I think, democratization of space, has probably allowed us to be able to not have a single node of failure, to be able to actually innovate in ways that will allow us to have resilience. Now, if we lost all the assets, then it could be technological Armageddon. So innovation will allow us to actually have some redundancy in some of those systems. But yes, if all the assets are damaged, then it can be, catastrophic for humanity, if you like.
But that's, if all the assets are damaged, then it wouldn't really matter in terms of which businesses, whether it was a business or a nation state that owned it. It's the same effect for the world, isn't it? We would still not have our be able to find our way, or financial transactions and all those other amazing things that space does for us.
Well, exactly. I mean, even now, you don't even have to lose all of that to be in trouble, at least temporarily. Just drop your mobile phone in a swimming pool or something, and then see how far you're going to get in the middle of London. How are you going to get around? Not just only navigation, but also payments and all the other things. So we are very dependent on technology. And of course, part of that technology is enabled by space technologies. I agree.
Sounds like you speak from experience, dropping your phone in a swimming pool, but you don't have to tell me. Is it going to get busy, too busy in space?
It'll get busy, but I'm not saying, I don't know what too busy means. There is a lot of space out there. Well, it looks kind of crowded, but there is a lot of space. So I'm not worried about too busy. We'll have systems to handle it as long as there are no bad actors. But the answer is yes, it'll get very busy. Hundreds of satellites to hundreds of thousands of satellites.
Where do you think the commercial space industry is going to be in 10, 20 years' time?
We usually underestimate the effect of some of these things, and really most futurists don't know because we cannot forecast what will happen. They say that, in fact, by 2035, 2040, we will be $1.4 trillion economy as far as the space industry is concerned. In terms of what it'll be very much enabled, AI enabled. It'll be autonomous satellites, robots. We talk about driverless cars kind of coming on our roads very, very soon. And in possibly 10, 15 years' time, we will not even be allowed to drive ourselves because we'll be too dangerous. It's likely to happen with spacecraft as well. They will be autonomous. They'll be working in constellations, swarm intelligence type of idea, and they will be the scouts for us. We will be sending them to Mars and elsewhere before we go.
Would you go to Mars if you could?
I would give my right arm.
Thank you, Andy. Lots to think about there. I'll come back to you shortly. A reminder that you can submit comments and questions via our podcast Twitter @ZeroPressurePod. We're keen to hear from you. May even feature your questions in the next episode, so please do get in touch. Our second guest is Pekka Laurila, Chief Strategy Officer and co-founder of ICEYE, a company that provides access to timely and reliable satellite imagery of the Earth. ICEYE is the first organisation in the world to successfully launch synthetic aperture radar, or SAR, satellites with a launch mass under 100 kilograms. Pekka graduated in geomatics from Finland's Aalto University, where he played an instrumental role in working on Aalto 1, which is Finland's flagship satellite project. He was ICEYE's chief financial officer at the beginning, and Pekka received the 2018 Forbes 30 Under 30 award alongside ICEYE's co-founder Rafał Modrzewski, based on the world's first achievements of the company. Welcome to Zero Pressure, Pekka.
Thanks. Looking forward to discussion.
What does new space mean to you?
It means to me all of the new exciting things that are happening in the domain of space right now. It's about sort of like really increasing the pace of the innovation and the sort of cost effectiveness and sustainability, utilizing space as a domain, for business. With it, then the idea of cost effectiveness of doing anything really in that domain, will become more accessible and more available, just because the sort of scales and the economies of scale come into play.
What has changed recently that has enabled your company to do what it's doing that you might not have been able to do before?
I'm sort of equating that change is, you could draw analogies to like how internet came to be, in a way that there is an era of time when this type of high technology is something that is purely done in sort of state research type programs, because it's fundamentally extremely high cost and extremely high risk. And then as is that sort of very basic infrastructure and discoveries get laid out, then it becomes usable to say more research and academic institutions, and then when further of that infra is there, and then the investments have been made to lay the foundation, so to speak, then the time for the commercial industry in a way comes to play. But also the other things that are maybe more maybe not as binary, but more gradual is of course in the sort of exponential rate of energy efficiency, cost efficiency, computation, and the miniaturization of components, for other reasons than space specifically. Being able to leverage, just that general exponential growth of technology industry as such gives you the sort of economies of scale and ability to do things differently that effectively makes the business models possible.
So it sounds like you're saying to me that there's so many different aspects to this. It just happens to be that we're in a time where they're all now coming together. And if you've got the vision and the agility as your company has to get in there, could almost anybody just start up, or do you need to have that USP, that special thing that you're selling to make the difference for your own company?
I think in a way right now, maybe the thing that has changed is the idea that now indeed you can launch a technology business that operates in the domain of space, just as you can launch a technology business that operates in domain of cars or domain of shipping or domain of robotics. The key thing to remember is that it's still a high-tech business, and any business that is built kind of as this type of sort of high-tech or deep-tech venture, you absolutely need to have the unique piece of value that you are bringing to the table. And it's also absolutely true in the same way as, say, you try to build autonomous cars or something. It's not cheap. That the amount of upfront investment in space industry that you need in technology development and building the initial infrastructure is still very large comparatively to, say, a mobile gaming company. You need to not only have a sort of unique idea, unique business case, unique team, but you also need to be able to really finance that with a fair bit of upfront investment.
So Pekka, for people who don't know, what is SAR, and what have you done with it that makes it so special now?
SAR comes from the words synthetic aperture radar. It's about imaging but imaging with radio waves as opposed to light waves. The big difference, of course, doing SAR imaging as opposed to doing optical imaging or imaging with a camera in a way is that in camera, the light comes from an external source, whereas then in the case of radar imaging, it is the radar that is transmitting the energy. So the radar is transmitting pulses of radio waves, that then travel from the satellite, all the way to the ground and then reflect out of whatever there is and then make their way all the way back, into the satellite's sensor. What's different in how ICEYE is doing this as of now is I think it's along the general lines of the sort of new space as a philosophy that in the end we're utilizing the sort of fundamental technology and algorithms in a very similar way as they have been done in the past, but taking the approach of using components that have been developed for other industries allows us to have that economy of scale, so we can push that high performance into something that is extremely cost efficient.
Could your technology be applied elsewhere, do you think? I'm thinking perhaps to another type of technology or another application.
Yeah, so if you think how many things in that chain have to work for the right type of radio waves, coming out of the device at high power and then going hundreds of kilometers through space and then reflecting from the ground and making their way hundreds of kilometers back and still being recognizable to some extent. In that chain there is very large amount of technology, all the way from radio frequency equipment on the analog side, in digital signal processing, storage, memory. So in a very broad sense, the type of technology that ICEYE is developing, of course, has a very wide area of use over all kinds of industries, really.
How do you see your business changing in the next few years?
So we are right now in the sort of very much an exponential phase of development. You can see how that type of exponential phase, looks like in other tech companies, and we're seeing, certainly kind of similar rapid growth. That if you look back, the last couple of years, we have been doubling in the size of the team. We have been doubling in the amount of satellites. So the scale of growth and investment right now is very heavy. And I think the biggest change that we will see from today to the next few years is exactly kind of us reaching always sort of new scale of ability to operate. That when you go from being able to access some places every day, you can serve certain type of use cases. When you can get to accessing certain places in every few hours, then you can serve different type of use cases. So in a way, the biggest change that we will see is that more of the applications that we've envisioned to be available on top of this type of infrastructure that we're building, will actually become available.
Do you rely on Finnish government investment, and do you see that continuing, if so?
So we've received, really tremendous, support from the Finnish governmental side and, the Finnish academic side, especially in the early days of the company, when amount of state support for R&D of course, is best spent, the earlier and earlier stages, when the technological risk is higher and higher, sort of, sharing the risk. And now majority of ICEYE's financing, comes from the investors and then the customers, but there certainly is still a level of governmental R&D financing directly from the Finnish government, and then also the governmental R&D financing from the EU level. This is very important, and then we certainly will keep on leveraging these instruments, but the aim is not to have to keep relying on state support really from any state.
When do you foresee you might get to that stage where you are completely free from state investment? Do you have a particular date in mind, and how long is that from when your company started up?
I think you have to separate two things. One being, research and development into new areas, and then one is running a business on this sort of let's say engineering and manufacturing and operations, and in kind of going for the new kind of fundamentally new areas where we are kind of really pushing the envelope. These are the areas where R&D financing instruments are really at their best. State type R&D financing we try to utilize in areas where we are taking kind of the next technological leaps, and share the risk there. But the sort of areas where we are focusing on development and then scaling up the business, this is something that actually has a business case and is supported by just pure private investment and the customers.
And can you see some of the big names that we have at the moment, whether they're new big names or the old traditional ones, but can you see them sort of merging with a lot of the new companies that are coming up at the moment? Speaking generally, not particularly about ICEYE, but do you think that there is just space for perhaps most of the new companies just to remain intact and grow themselves?
So in a very similar sense to, if you think other tech industry space, there is a fair bit of consolidation around kind of the large companies, your Googles and Facebooks and so forth. And to a degree, it is a very natural way of how the sort of ecosystem around this type of high tech industry or technology industry works. So in that sense, it is extremely unlikely that all the names that are currently there in the sort of startup phase are going to be around as large companies over the next 5 years. But that's kind of never really the point of an industry like this. Some of the ideas, of course, won't work at all. That's also a thing that is very normal. But then then the ones that do work, some of them will end up competing each other, and then some of them will end up consolidating. And that's just like a very normal progression of the sort of technology industry. But of course, what is maybe new in the same way as like when internet was the new frontier, space as a domain, it's like literally infinite.
I love that. Space is literally infinite. Another reminder, we're keen to hear from you, from all our listeners. So please do send us your thoughts, comments and questions through our Twitter channel @ZeroPressurePod. So let's come back to both of our guests now. In the first episode of this Zero Pressure podcast, we talked a bit about I suppose the threats and regulations. What about the cyber threat? Does that concern you at all?
Up to now, there hasn't been, or at least to our knowledge, any reported cases of sabotage or denial of service or some kind of spoofing, reading messages and so on. I'm sure they try, some of those actors, but it hasn't been a huge problem. Now that we have more and more satellites playing a more and more important role, then already the threats have begun. All of those measures, all of the cybersecurity threats, vulnerabilities, threats, and countermeasures that we have for terrestrial systems, we will find also on satellites as well.
You have to be concerned, of that, to some degree, but I guess like the difference isn't that big compared to, say, how much, has a bank or a automotive company, how much they have to think about the security of IP or security of operations or security even around, safety of operations. So overall, over the let's say technology industry, we share the same concerns and share the same best practices. So in that sense, we're getting good scale out of the best practice solutions like this.
Christer Fuglesang, the Swedish astronaut, talked about the need for international regulations. Will regulations stifle all of the new commercialism, for instance? Some people will say we shouldn't have any at all.
I think that we know that it is better to be able to be good international citizens because that makes it good for all of us. When the car proliferated in the roads, then, when we only had 1 or 2 cars, we didn't need any traffic rules. But now that we have thousands of cars every day, in some cities, millions of cars, we need some traffic rules. And if you don't have traffic rules, if the traffic lights go out, there is chaos in the highway and nobody's helped by that. I think it's the same with particularly debris and other uses of space. For instance, some military in some countries decide to just to test to see whether they can weaponize space, and they blow a satellite up, as it happened recently. That satellite generates hundreds or thousands of fragments that themselves become bullets, if you like, in space that can cause other collisions. So those kinds of acts, they need to be curtailed. And we can only do it really through regulations, treaties, and understandings for the benefit of everyone.
As an overall philosophical question, regulations certainly can stifle innovation, if the regulations are made in a way that they stifle innovation. Have we seen a lot of that in our own business right now? I wouldn't say so. There are usually reasons why they exist. And of course, the purpose of the regulations is to, establish, not necessarily level playing field, but, even the fact that the playing field exists, is something that you try to establish with regulations. And, they are extremely important, for that purpose. But of course, you can easily also make regulations that, really prevent teams, people, companies, being at their most innovative and at their highest scale. Sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes you can, find areas where it's not necessary. But as of right now, we haven't really had any major reason to say that regulations would have stifled development of ICEYE.
Thank you, Andy and Pekka, for sharing your insights and experiences with us. It's been a real delight to hear your bright and positive thoughts about our future in space.
Helen, it's been the most enjoyable conversation with you and with Pekka, and it's a real pleasure for me and a privilege to be part of the Zero Pressure episodes. So thanks again, and all the very best to you and your listeners.
Thanks, it was fun.
And thank you for listening and joining us on this podcast journey, which has taken us into orbit with satellites we use every day down on Earth. If this conversation about the new space economy has got you thinking and you'd like to ask me or our guests any questions, please do reach out to us on Twitter at Zero Pressure Pod. We may feature your questions in the next episode. Some questions we've received from our last discussion about human-machine teaming and whether and when this technology will be able to deliver public benefit at scale or solve a real-world problem, with answers kindly provided by Professor Nick Hawes of the University of Oxford. Which industries do you think would benefit from human-machine teaming that don't often come up in conversations around this topic? Well, Nick says perhaps one that isn't commonly thought of is the monitoring of ecosystems. Here, it's easy to imagine humans deploying fleets of robots and sensors, but working with the systems to task the team, analyse models and make forecasts. The machine element's particularly valuable here since the scale of the spatial and the timeline elements need automation, but the human element is needed to decide how best to use the capabilities. And another question, some human-machine teaming systems take the body language and speech patterns of human users as important inputs. Are there efforts being made to ensure neurodivergent individuals with non-typical body language and speech patterns are accounted for in the designing of teaming systems? Now, this question takes Nick a bit outside his area, but he can say that there will be no one-size-fits-all solution that works well immediately for any human-machine interface. The machine elements will need to learn about and adapt to how an individual wants to interact. Now, this gives space for neurodivergent individuals to work with such systems, provided the learning systems are not heavily biased against such individual variation. Here's a question directed at me personally. Current human-machine interfaces that connect machines with the human nervous system, such as prosthetic limbs and hearing aids, are largely focused on recovering lost functionality. Would Helen ever choose to use a human-machine interface that gave a gain of function, as was the case with researchers at Duke University, who gave rats the ability to see infrared light by wiring a head-mounted sensor into their brains? Yes, I mean, I would love to be able to see more, especially ultraviolet light. But I do think there are ethical considerations to make about whether or not this ability should be made known to other people, or the possibility of it being done by genetic modification and then passed on to offspring. It's a great topic for debates, though. I look forward to hearing from you and to our next discussion, so please do get in touch. In the meantime, I leave you with the words of the writer Arthur C. Clarke, who said, "We cannot predict the new forces, powers and discoveries that will be disclosed to us when we reach the other planets and set up new laboratories in space. They are as much beyond our vision today as fire or electricity would be beyond the imagination of a fish."